The delivery room went silent. What should have been the happiest moment of his life turned into a nightmare. In that instant, a Texas man realized his entire marriage was built on a lie. Hours later, one of them would be dead. Michael Coleman had waited 9 months to hold his first child. His wife Sarah had carried what he believed was their baby through morning sickness, doctor visits, and late-night preparations for parenthood. But when the medical team discovered the truth that September evening in 2019, everything Michael thought he knew about his marriage crumbled in seconds. How could a secret like this stay hidden for years? And what drives a person to kill when the truth finally comes out? The answers will shock you more than you can imagine. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Michael and Sarah Coleman were the picture of small-town perfection in Beaumont, Texas. They met at First Presbyterian Church during the annual summer barbecue in 2015, where Sarah had volunteered to help serve food to local families. Michael, a 29-year-old electrician with kind eyes and a gentle smile, was immediately drawn to Sarah's warm personality and infectious laugh. She was 26, worked as a receptionist at a local dental office, and seemed to light up every room she entered. Their friends described them as inseparable from their very first conversation, talking for hours about their shared love of country music, weekend fishing trips, and dreams of starting a family someday. Within 6 months, they were engaged. Their wedding in spring 2016 was exactly what you'd expect from a couple deeply in love in East Texas. Sarah wore her grandmother's pearl necklace, Michael's father served as best man, and the reception was held in the church fellowship hall with homemade decorations and Sarah's famous peach cobbler for dessert. Neighbors on their quiet street in the Westbrook subdivision remembered them as the young couple who waved from their front porch every evening, who brought Christmas cookies to elderly residents, and who seemed genuinely happy in a way that made everyone around them smile. Social media posts from their early marriage show weekend camping trips, Michael teaching Sarah to fish, and lazy Sunday afternoons watching football with friends gathered around their television. But beneath the surface of this seemingly perfect marriage, something was building that none of their friends or family could have imagined. Sarah had secrets that went back years before she met Michael, secrets so profound that when they finally surfaced, they would destroy not just their marriage, but their lives. The warning signs were subtle, almost invisible to anyone not looking for them. Michael's sister Jennifer would later tell police that she always found it odd how Sarah avoided certain topics about her past, how she deflected questions about her family, and how she seemed uncomfortable during intimate moments at family gatherings when women shared stories about their bodies and health. Their first date was at Tony's barbecue on a Thursday evening in July 2015. Michael ordered the brisket plate. Sarah got the pulled pork sandwich but barely touched it. She seemed nervous, fidgeting with her napkin and asking Michael dozens of questions about himself while revealing little about her own background. When he asked about her childhood in Louisiana, she quickly changed the subject to ask about his work at the electrical company. This pattern would continue throughout their entire relationship. Sarah was an expert at deflection, at making conversations about Michael's life, his dreams, his family, while keeping her own past carefully locked away. Their romance moved quickly, perhaps too quickly in retrospect. By September, Sarah had moved into Michael's small apartment on College Street. His friends joked that he was smitten beyond reason, bringing Sarah flowers every Friday and talking about her constantly at work. She seemed equally devoted, packing his lunch every morning and waiting up for him when he worked late. But co-workers at the dental office where Sarah worked noticed things that Michael didn't see. Dr. Williams, the dentist who employed Sarah, would later tell investigators that Sarah always found excuses to avoid the annual employee physical exams that were required for their health insurance. She claimed to have a regular doctor in Louisiana and said she preferred to handle medical appointments during her vacation time. The engagement happened on Christmas morning 2015 in Michael's parents' living room, surrounded by wrapping paper and the smell of his mother's cinnamon rolls. Sarah cried when she saw the modest diamond ring Michael had saved for months to afford. She called her sister in Louisiana immediately to share the news, but when Michael asked to speak to her family, Sarah said they were too emotional to talk. This would become another pattern. Throughout their engagement and marriage, Michael never spoke directly to any of Sarah's relatives. She claimed they were shy, that they didn't like talking on the phone, that they preferred to keep family matters private. Michael, raised in a close-knit family where everyone shared everything, found this strange but attributed it to cultural differences between Texas and Louisiana families. Wedding planning revealed more peculiarities in Sarah's behavior. She insisted on a small ceremony with only Michael's family and friends attending. She said her relatives couldn't afford to travel from Louisiana, and she seemed embarrassed about her family's financial situation. Michael offered to help pay for their travel expenses, but Sarah became upset and said she didn't want charity. The wedding was beautiful despite the absence of Sarah's family, but Michael's mother, Barbara, later admitted she found it heartbreaking that Sarah had no one there to support her on such an important day. Barbara tried to fill that role, helping Sarah with her dress and makeup, but she sensed a sadness in Sarah that went deeper than pre-wedding nerves. Their early married life seemed blissful. Sarah threw herself into being the perfect wife, cooking elaborate dinners, keeping their small house spotless, and supporting Michael's career ambitions. She encouraged him to start his own electrical contracting business, helping him with paperwork and customer calls in the evenings. But there were signs that something wasn't right, signs that would only make sense later when viewed through the lens of Sarah's deception. She avoided doctor visits, claiming she was healthy and didn't need regular checkups. When Michael suggested they start trying for a baby in their second year of marriage, Sarah deflected, saying she wanted to wait until his business was more established. She was taking birth control pills, she told him, and wanted to plan their family carefully. Friends noticed that Sarah was secretive about her body in ways that seemed unusual even for a modest person. At Neighborhood, in January 2019, 3 years into their marriage, Sarah announced she was pregnant. Michael was overjoyed, immediately calling his parents and sister to share the news. Sarah claimed she had taken a home pregnancy test and showed him the positive result. She made an appointment with Dr. Martinez, an obstetrician in Beaumont, and Michael eagerly accompanied her to what he believed was their first prenatal visit. But Dr. Martinez would later testify that Sarah came to that appointment alone 3 days earlier, explaining that she needed help maintaining a pregnancy deception. What Michael didn't know was that Sarah had confided in Dr. Martinez about her biological situation and begged for help in finding a way to give Michael the child he desperately wanted. Dr. Martinez, bound by patient confidentiality but deeply troubled by the ethical implications, had initially refused to participate in any deception. However, Sarah broke down in tears, explaining that she loved Michael more than life itself and couldn't bear to lose him. She had already purchased a fake pregnancy test online and had been researching adoption options, hoping to present Michael with a baby that he would believe was biologically theirs. Dr. Martinez, moved by Sarah's desperation but concerned about the legal and medical implications, agreed to help Sarah find legitimate adoption resources while strongly encouraging her to tell Michael the truth about her identity. Throughout the pregnancy, Sarah's deception became increasingly elaborate and psychologically taxing. She purchased a pregnancy prosthetic online that allowed her to simulate the appearance of a growing belly. She studied pregnancy symptoms extensively, claiming to experience morning sickness that kept her home from work several mornings each week. Michael was incredibly attentive, bringing her crackers and ginger ale, rubbing her feet in the evenings, and talking excitedly about their future child. Each act of kindness from Michael made Sarah's deception feel heavier, but she had convinced herself that once they had a baby, the lie about her biological sex would no longer matter. Sarah had been working with a private adoption agency in Houston, using her real identity and medical history to complete the necessary paperwork. She had explained her situation to the adoption counselor, Sarah Martinez, no relation to Dr. Martinez, who had initially been shocked but ultimately sympathetic to Sarah's complex situation. The adoption agency helped Sarah find a young mother in Dallas, who was planning to place her baby for adoption and whose due date aligned perfectly with Sarah's fictitious pregnancy timeline. Sarah had planned to tell Michael that their baby was born prematurely and had been rushed to neonatal intensive care, giving her time to complete the adoption process and bring home what Michael would believe was their biological child. However, the plan began to unravel in August 2019. The birth mother in Dallas decided to keep her baby, leaving Sarah desperate to find another solution with just weeks remaining in her supposed pregnancy. She contacted multiple adoption agencies, becoming increasingly frantic as her options dwindled. Michael noticed her anxiety and attributed it to normal pregnancy stress, becoming even more protective and supportive. He took time off work to drive her to prenatal appointments, painted the nursery in soft yellow and green colors, since they had decided to wait to learn the baby's gender, and spent evenings assembling the crib they had chosen together. On September 15, 2019, Sarah went into what she claimed was early labor. She had been experiencing fake contractions for several days, practicing the breathing techniques they had learned in their birthing class. Michael rushed her to Beaumont Memorial Hospital at 2 a.m., his hands shaking as he helped her from the car to the emergency room. Sarah was genuinely terrified, but not because of labor pains. She knew The maternity ward at Beaumont Memorial Hospital was busy that Monday morning, but Michael Coleman barely noticed the activity around him. His focus was entirely on Sarah, who had been admitted to labor and delivery at 3:15 a.m. The nurses, led by charge nurse Patricia Williams, began their standard admission procedures, while Michael held Sarah's hand and whispered encouragement. Sarah's heart was racing, but not from labor contractions. She knew that the moment the medical staff attempted to examine her, her deception would be exposed. Dr. Jennifer Ross, the on-call obstetrician, entered the room at 6:30 a.m. to assess Sarah's condition and prepare for delivery. What happened next would haunt everyone in that room for the rest of their lives. When Dr. Ross began her examination, she immediately realized that Sarah was not in labor, and more shockingly, had never been pregnant. The silence in the room stretched for what felt like eternity as Dr. Ross processed what she was seeing. Nurse Williams, who had assisted with hundreds of deliveries, looked from Sarah to Michael and back again, unable to comprehend the situation. Dr. Ross quietly asked the other medical staff to step outside, leaving only herself, Nurse Williams, Michael and Sarah in the suddenly suffocating hospital room. Michael's confusion turned to horror as Dr. Ross gently explained that there was no baby, that Sarah was not pregnant, and that based on her examination, Sarah had been assigned male at birth. The words seemed to hang in the air like smoke from a fire that had just consumed everything Michael believed about his life. Sarah was sobbing, reaching for Michael's hand, trying to explain through her tears that she loved him, that everything about their marriage was real, except for this one secret she had been too afraid to share. Michael pulled his hand away, staring at the woman he thought he knew, feeling like he was looking at a complete stranger. Nurse Williams, a mother of 3 who had seen many difficult situations in her career, tried to mediate as Michael's shock turned to anger. His voice, usually soft and measured, became loud and harsh as he demanded answers. How long had Sarah been deceiving him? Was their entire marriage a lie? Had she married him under false pretenses? Sarah tried to explain that she had been living as a woman for over a decade, that her identity as a woman was authentic even if her biology was different, that she had hoped they could adopt a child and build the family they both wanted. But Michael couldn't process her explanations. All he could hear was that the person he had loved, married, and planned a future with had been lying to him about something he considered fundamental to their relationship. Dr. Ross, recognizing the explosive nature of the situation, tried to encourage calm discussion and suggested professional counseling to help the couple work through this revelation. She explained that transgender individuals often struggle with when and how to disclose their history, and that Sarah's love for Michael appeared genuine even if her approach had been misguided. But Michael was beyond rational conversation. He stood up from the bedside chair, looked at Sarah with an expression she had never seen before, and said words that would echo in the courtroom months later. "You made a fool out of me. You made a fool out of my family. How could you do this to us?" Sarah's pleas for understanding only seemed to fuel his rage as the full implications of her deception sank in. By noon, Michael had called his parents and sister, struggling to find words to explain what had happened. His mother, Barbara, drove to the hospital immediately, hoping to help mediate the situation, but Michael was inconsolable. His father, Robert, a man who rarely showed emotion, broke down crying when he realized that the grandchild they had been expecting for months had never existed. Jennifer, Michael's sister, later described feeling like her auntie. Michael finally agreed to drive Sarah home from the hospital at 4:30 p.m., but the 20-minute ride was filled with tense silence. Sarah tried multiple times to start a conversation, to explain her perspective, to apologize for the deception, but Michael stared straight ahead with his hands gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles were white. When they arrived at their small house on Westbrook Drive, the sight of the nursery they had prepared together sent Michael into a new wave of rage. The yellow walls, the carefully assembled crib, the stuffed animals they had chosen together, all of it represented what he now saw as months of elaborate lies and manipulation. The argument that followed was loud enough for neighbors to hear through the thin walls of their 1950s-era home. Mrs. Patterson next door later told police that she heard Michael shouting questions like, "How could you do this to me?" and "What else have you lied about?" interspersed with Sarah's tearful attempts to explain and apologize. The confrontation moved from room to room as Michael demanded answers Sarah couldn't provide in a way that would satisfy his sense of betrayal. He wanted to know when she had planned to tell him, if she had ever planned to tell him, how she thought she could maintain such a massive deception indefinitely. What pushed Michael over the edge was not just the deception itself, but his growing realization of how the revelation would affect his reputation in their small community. Beaumont was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, and Michael could already imagine the whispered conversations at church, at work, at the grocery store. He felt humiliated not just privately, but publicly. His sense of masculinity, his role as husband and soon-to-be father, his standing in the community, all of it had been shattered by Sarah's revelation. In his fragmented mental state, he couldn't separate Sarah's transgender identity from what he perceived as deliberate humiliation and emasculation. The violence began around 6:15 p.m. when Sarah tried to reach for Michael's hand during another attempt to explain her actions. Michael shoved her away more forcefully than he had intended, causing Sarah to fall backward into their coffee table. The sound of breaking glass seemed to trigger something primal in Michael, and his anger transformed into physical aggression. Sarah tried to get up, bleeding from cuts on her arm, and attempted to leave the house. But Michael blocked her path to the door, and what had been shouting became hitting, pushing, and ultimately, in Michael's rage-fueled state, much worse. Neighbors reported that the shouting stopped abruptly around 6:30 p.m., followed by an eerie silence that lasted until police sirens could be heard approaching the house. Mrs. Patterson had called 911 when she heard what sounded like furniture breaking and Sarah screaming for help. The silence that followed her call was more frightening than the earlier arguing, and she watched from her window as police cars pulled up to the Coleman house. What officers found inside would haunt the first responders who entered the scene, and the details would later be presented to a jury that struggled to understand how love could transform so quickly into deadly violence. Detective Amanda Martinez, no relation to Dr. Martinez, was the first investigator on scene at 7:45 p.m. She found Michael sitting in his kitchen, his clothes blood-stained, staring blankly at the wall where wedding photos still hung showing happier times. Sarah's body was in the living room, and the scene told a story of escalating violence that had spiraled beyond anything Michael had probably intended when the argument began. The coffee table was destroyed, there was blood on the walls, and the nursery door stood open, revealing the room they had prepared for a child who would never exist. Michael's initial statement to police was rambling and contradictory. He alternated between expressing remorse for what had happened and anger about Sarah's deception. He kept repeating that Sarah had made a fool of him and his family, that everyone in town would be laughing at him, that he couldn't show his face at church or work knowing that people would be talking about how he had been tricked. Detective Martinez, experienced in domestic violence cases, recognized the classic signs of someone whose violence had been triggered by shame and humiliation rather than premeditated malice. The physical evidence told a clear story of what had happened, but understanding why it had happened required Detective Martinez to piece together the psychological factors that had led to the tragedy. Interviews with Michael's family and friends revealed a man who had always defined himself through traditional gender roles and community standing. His sense of identity was closely tied to being seen as a strong, competent husband and provider. Sarah's revelation had not just ended his marriage, it had destroyed his sense of self in a way that his mentally unstable state couldn't process rationally. Dr. Patricia Reynolds, a forensic psychologist brought in to evaluate Michael's mental state, found a man completely shattered by the discovery of his wife's deception. Michael's psychological profile revealed someone who had never learned healthy coping mechanisms for dealing with complex emotions or challenging situations. His worldview was rigid and black and white, making it impossible for him to process the nuances of Sarah's situation or the genuine love she had felt for him despite her deception. In his fractured mental state, he couldn't separate Sarah's transgender identity from what he perceived as a personal attack on his masculinity and dignity. The investigation also revealed the elaborate nature of Sarah's deception and the psychological toll it had taken on her over the years. Friends from before her marriage described Sarah as someone who lived in constant fear of discovery, who had nightmares about losing Michael, and who had become increasingly anxious as their marriage progressed. The adoption paperwork showed the desperate lengths she had gone to in order to give Michael the child he wanted, and her medical records revealed the stress-related health issues she had developed while maintaining her deception. Sarah had been as trapped by her lies as Michael had been deceived by them, creating a tragic situation where both people were victims of circumstances that had spiraled beyond anyone's control. The trial of Michael Coleman began 8 months later in Jefferson County District Court, with the media attention bringing national focus to issues of transgender rights, marriage fraud, and the legal definition of deception in intimate relationships. Prosecutor Janet Williams argued that regardless of the circumstances that led to Michael's discovery of Sarah's identity, murder was never an acceptable response to feeling deceived or humiliated. She painted a picture of a man who had chosen violence over communication, who had allowed his wounded pride to transform him into a killer of the person who had loved him most. Defense attorney Robert Chen, no relation to Sarah's first husband, argued that Michael had been the victim of fraud so profound that it constituted psychological abuse, leading to a temporary break with reality that made him not fully responsible for his actions. The defense strategy centered on the argument that Sarah's deception had been so comprehensive and long-lasting that it constituted a form of psychological manipulation that had damaged Michael's mental health. They brought in expert witnesses to testify about the psychological impact of discovering such fundamental deceptions in intimate relationships. The jury struggled with the complex ethical and legal questions raised by the case. While they found Michael's actions inexcusable, some jurors expressed sympathy for the psychological trauma he had experienced upon discovering Sarah's identity. Others argued that Sarah's deception, while misguided, had been motivated by love and fear rather than malicious intent to harm. The trial highlighted the broader social questions about transgender disclosure in relationships and the difference between legal fraud and personal privacy regarding gender identity. After 3 days of deliberation, the jury found Michael guilty of second-degree murder, accepting the prosecution's argument that while his actions may have been triggered by emotional trauma, he had made conscious choices that led to Sarah's death. Judge Patricia Morrison sentenced Michael to 25 years in prison, noting that while she acknowledged the psychological complexity of the case, nothing could justify taking another person's life. Sarah's death had not only ended her own future, but had destroyed Michael's life and traumatized both families in ways that would never fully heal. The case of Michael and Sarah Coleman forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about honesty, identity, and the devastating consequences of deception in intimate relationships. Could honesty have saved Sarah's life, or was this a tragedy destined to explode the moment the truth came out? Sarah's fear of rejection had led her to build a life on a foundation of lies, while Michael's rigid worldview and inability to process complex emotions had transformed him from a loving husband into a killer. When lies mix with love, when fear meets inflexibility, when pride collides with truth, the cost can be deadly. Both Michael and Sarah were trapped by their own limitations, creating a perfect storm that ended in irreversible tragedy. Do you think Michael's rage was justified, or was this an act of pure evil? How do we balance understanding the psychological factors that led to violence with holding people accountable for their actions? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and next week we'll explore another case where a killer left a confession so bizarre, detectives thought it was fiction.